Hello, everyone, and welcome to How I Built This Resilience Edition from NPR. Let me just make sure I'm recording here. I am. This is the place where we talk about how businesses are navigating these challenging times, how they're building resilience. One of my favorite things about the past year has been this casual, comfortable clothing, like this hoodie that I'm wearing, because I've worn it pretty much every day over the past year. Um, my guest today is Bayard Winthrop, CEO and founder of American Giant. This is a company that actually made this sweatshirt. And just to be clear, I bought this. I bought several of these because I'm a big fan of them. It's an American-made casual clothing company based in San Francisco. They are best known for these hoodies, these classic kind of zip-up hoodies that, if you are old like me, will remind you of the hoodies you wore when you were a kid in the 80s, 70s. I actually met Bayard about 10 years ago when I used to host the NPR show All Things Considered. We did a whole segment on American manufacturing, and we told the story of American Giant. It's a really cool story, and I can't wait for you to hear it. Last year, when the shutdowns began, Bayard had to figure out, how to keep the business going when production was put on hold, and he even spent time working out of his car. So we're going to dig into all of that and more. Bayard, welcome. Great to see you.
Great to see you, Guy. Thanks for having me.
And before we get into it, if you're watching via Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, LinkedIn, please submit your questions for Bayard Winthrop. We're taking your questions, so let's keep them coming in. Okay, Bayard, for people who don't know what American Giant is, give us a background. What is it?
Well, it's a 10-year-old business that really was founded on a very simple idea that we could still make great things in America, great clothing in America, and we started the business 10 years ago with the sweatshirt you're wearing. Actually, it was a single product that we kind of poured our life and soul into, and the business is bigger than that now and a wider product line. But it basically was built on an idea that everyone at the time was saying wasn't possible, that you could build a good, healthy, vibrant clothing business entirely in the United States, and the customers would respond to it. And so started out online only, and now we've got some retail stores. But it's a pretty basic idea that I think the customers out there have been looking for and wanting for a long time, and no one had really, I think, taken the leap to try it.
Bayard, we should mention that you are based in San Francisco, and oftentimes people, and I'm sure people say to you, "Wait, you make sweatshirts and T-shirts and apparel in San Francisco, right?" But
Yeah.
you do have a background in tech. You were in the tech world for some time. How did you get the idea to leave that behind and start an apparel company in San Francisco? How did that happen?
Well, I think, I started off my career in finance actually, and left that quite quickly, realizing that I wasn't any good at it, and I had no interest in it really. And then sort of luckily found myself in a company that was making a physical product, a snowshoe of all things. And once you get at least in my case, once you get your arms around the physical product and the making of something, that bug kind of never leaves you. And I did for a brief period run a tech company, an early internet company. But that, if more than anything else, that reinforced my total desire to be in the making of physical products, and so that part of the transition was quite easy. The contrast of being in San Francisco with sort of this tech capital with a real manufacturing business, that's an interesting one. We are kind of one half a tech business because we've got a big e-commerce business. A lot of our business has to do with taking advantage of the innovations in manufacturing innovations, but also technology and technological and e-commerce innovations. And then the other half of it is manufacturing. And a lot of that is in places like North and South Carolina, where the bulk of our production is done. And we actually have some factories down there. So it's a bit schizophrenic because it's one part tech, one part old world manufacturing. So it's been a pretty interesting 10-year journey of balancing those two things.
One of the things that attracted me to your story and your clothing is that it's American made. And I say that, and I want to be clear about that, because I don't mean this in a jingoistic way, like go America, American made is the best. That's not what I mean at all. There are excellent products that are made in China, in Mexico. There are excellent products made in Europe, made around the world. And I love particularly products that are made for domestic markets are often even better. The reason why I love the idea of clothing made in America is because it's not traveling on a ship across halfway around the world, and it has a smaller carbon footprint. And I think that's also a big reason behind your thinking. It's not about sort of, this sort of America first idea, right? Like, we should be clear about that. It's just about using local products using local materials to make your product.
That's right, and maybe even a little understated. I think the one part of it is that the act of making clothing was for many years quite a simple thing actually, and was typically quite localized. Over the last 20 or 30 years, as the globalized economy has become globalized and very complicated, what is happening in the apparel industry now, which has been this sort of relentless march towards cheaper and cheaper and cheaper production, has also made the globalized manufacturing ecosystem wildly complicated. That actually kind of came into focus during the pandemic, I think. But proximity and localness not only drives better environmental practices because you're close and you're not moving things, as you say, across oceans and making things oftentimes in countries that maybe don't have the best environmental standards, but just the act of being close to the people and the places that make the things that you make, in my judgment, makes for a better business. I oftentimes say that, if you ask me how knowing a cotton farmer in North Carolina makes a better sweatshirt, I can't draw a direct line from A to B to tell you how, other than to just tell you that it does, and that our level of connection to the people and the places that make our products make us better stewards of the products. We're better caretakers of our customers and our producers. So you're absolutely right. There's phenomenal stuff being made overseas, in many cases better than what the American capability still has. But there are benefits by staying local as well that are rooted in quality and responsibility, I think.
Yeah, and I think probably case in point is the iPhone, which is, of course, made in China, and it's a phenomenal product.
That's right.
Bayard, why is it so hard? And maybe it's not, but why? I mean, why are so few clothing brands manufactured in the U.S.? Is it that hard to make clothing in the U.S.? Is it the cost? Why?
I would say that it's more expensive. So you've got labor rates in America, and it really boils down to the cost of labor, I think, more than anything else. There are other factors, but that's the big one. And so I think it's more expensive. And I think that for many, many years, the dominant paradigm in apparel particularly was to drive cheap and to drive the means of the cost of production down. And so during that time, there has been, I think, a progressive decaying of the manufacturing base domestically, but there are real strengths and bright spots as well. So at first it was motivated by cheaper means of production. That drove, I think, diminishing investment in domestic manufacturing. So it's quite striking now that when you go into facilities overseas, you oftentimes will see more modern, more updated manufacturing capabilities than you see here domestically. On the other hand, part of this journey for us too has been, as we have stood up a supply chain now across t-shirts and sweatshirts and jeans and pants and jackets, you do find these incredible pockets of capability that have driven our business forward. So it's a mixed answer. I think that the maybe the overly simplistic thing has been that brands have been incented by shareholders to chase cheap production and better margins as much as possible, and they've been in some ways incented by our trade structures and our economic policies to incent them to do that. So that's a factor too, obviously.
And by consumer behavior, right? Because we're so used to just buying something cheap, wearing it for a short period of time, and throwing it away. I should be clear about something. Your sweatshirts are not inexpensive. They are more expensive than people might imagine, but they last. I mean, this is the second one I've had. The first one I think I wore out after 7 years. It got frayed, and I mean, it was amazing. But 7 years with one sweatshirt. So they cost more, but you get what you pay for.
Well, thank you for saying that. That's nice to hear. It is certainly true that 40 years ago, just as a generalized comment, in America, we bought fewer things and we paid a bit more for them in today's dollars. And there has been this shift towards almost disposable clothing that I think has got bad implications for us as consumers and bad implications for the environment and a bunch of other things. And you're right, consumers have a role to play. I will say, though, that I think it is a big ask to ask consumers to recognize why it may make sense to pay $116 for a sweatshirt or $88 for a sweatshirt versus $29 for a sweatshirt. I think we have an obligation as business leaders, as policymakers, as the media, to help understand what the costs of cheap are, because it isn't quite as simple as to say, oh, a sweatshirt's made for $29. You actually pay for that in ways maybe that are harder to see, and lost manufacturing capability in the U.S. and maybe environmental impact and other things. And so it is true that consumers, I think, quite logically will go for cheaper most often than not. And I think we have a responsibility to communicate why there are other alternatives in the market in terms of quality and durability and maybe more responsible business practices. But that's our job, right? And I think the consumer's job is to judge us on the job that we're doing and to see whether we're putting a good enough product into the market to make them happy that they bought it.
It's amazing because, and you know this, and a lot of people listening and watching will know this. There was a time where shoes were made in New England. There are all these shuttered shoe factories all over New Hampshire and Massachusetts and in Vermont. There was a time when textiles, all textiles were really made in North Carolina. Still has a robust textile industry, right? Cotton is still grown in the United States, in parts of the United States. It's all just more expensive. Is it possible? I mean, is your entire supply chain American, from the zippers to the stitches to the cotton to the dyes to these little rivets at the end? Is it all American made?
Everything is, with a couple of exceptions. So merino wool, for example, which is a type of wool
Right.
that we use. There's not a great supply of merino wool, but our basic guiding philosophy is we will run through walls to keep things domestic. If it's still possible to do it, we will. There was you may have heard about our effort to do an American yarn dyed flannel a couple of years ago. That capability had essentially left the United States, and we spent a year and a half of our working life to try to re-stand up that supply chain successfully, ultimately. But it was hard, and I think that generally is our posture. That we kind of reject the notion that you can't do things here anymore. There's some exceptions to that. Very, very high-end technical fabrics that take you to the top of mountains. Those textiles, by and large, have left. Like I said, merino wool. But other than that, we do basically everything domestic from the cotton up. And that's just a good guiding principle that keeps us committed to what we're trying to do here. And we're not total purists about it, but we're 99% pure about it, I would say.
What do you think would make it easier or more attractive for manufacturers to produce their clothing in the United States? If obviously labor costs are always going to be high, and they should be high, and I guess ideally union as well, so employees are treated fairly. But what do you think are ways that could attract other manufacturers to either return their manufacturing to the U.S. or keep their manufacturing in the U.S.? Are there simple things that can be done?
I don't know if they're simple, but that's a very important question. I would maybe frame it up this way. I think, in my judgment, labor rates should be high. You should be rewarded for working well in unskilled and skilled jobs in this country. That's my opinion. But I also think it is an inconsistent policy from DC to say we're going to burden our domestic capability with high labor costs, let's say, or higher environmental standards, and then at the same time be incenting our big corporations to advantage themselves by chasing the cheapest labor or the poorest environmental standards. So I think those two things are inconsistent, and the answer lives in there somewhat. I think to the extent that we can begin to even out the playing field between what we are allowing to happen from a manufacturing standpoint internationally and what we are holding our domestic producers to, that's a big step to begin to level that up a bit more. I've got a great partner of ours who produces our yarns, and the CEO of that company always says to me, define free trade first, and then I'll tell you if I'm for it or not. And what he means by that is, if I'm competing on a level playing field with my international competitors, I'm all in. I'll go toe to toe. But if it's an uneven playing field, then you're unfairly burdening me in the market. So one piece of that, I think, is policy out of DC. Another piece of that is retailers. I'm really encouraged by Walmart's $350 billion Made in America initiative, because I think as retailers begin to acknowledge and lean in and say, we are going to be a part of the solution here, and we're going to demand that our suppliers source domestically, what that does, incredibly importantly, is it gives, in textiles, for example, our partners the ability to know that they're going to have a consistent bit of work for, not measured in months, but in quarters or years. And that gives them the confidence to have the capital investments to invest in innovation and technology and automation, those things that are going to help them stay competitive. I think brands have a responsibility to lead. I think that brands like American Giant and others in textiles should begin to be a part of the solution there. There's a lot of things in the short term that people could shift domestically, things like socks and T-shirts. The U.S. is actually quite competitive in those categories. It would be great to see some of the bigger brands move in that direction. And then finally, to your point, I think consumers. And ideally, we're doing a great job educating consumers about the trade-offs and doing a good job building great product and great valuable product, and they're responding by directing their dollars. But I think those first three are the ones that matter the most. The policy changes, the retailers, and the brands. I think those are the ones that really have to begin to turn the ship around and give us a good dimensional economy that has the making of things as a big part of what we do as a country.
In the time since you launched American Giant, there have been other, let's say, athleisure companies. I don't know if you would describe American Giant as athleisure, but it's in that category. Some very good brands, Outdoor Voices and Vuori, and I have some of those products. They're very good products, but they are generally made overseas. Those companies, valuations have skyrocketed and have attracted a lot of investors. I have to imagine that your growth has been slower as a result of the decisions you have made to remain domestic.
It has, and a lot of that was intentional. We one of the first investors that we had was the guy that basically built Pepsi Cola, a guy named Don Kendall, and he grew up on a dairy farm and was he drank a blue can of Pepsi and a bag of yellow Lay's potato chips every day of his life till he died at 99.
Wow!
And he was a remarkable guy, and he never got involved in the day-to-day stuff, but he got involved in the big picture stuff, and he would remind me what we were here to do. And basically, in essence, that was to build a durable generational brand that produced great products and that lived by our values. And so I think one of the things and we were not without our mistakes here, but I think a lot of what happened in the early e-commerce days were brands raising tons of venture capital money, really chasing growth above all else. And that can be pretty attractive. It certainly was for us. We grew very, very fast for the first 4 years of the business. But he reminded me that when you grow that fast, the temptation to let go of values and quality is put to the test. And so he just gave me the courage and the partnership to say, we're here for the long haul, and we are going to try to do things steadily and well, and over the long haul be judged by our actions and our values and how the consumers respond to it. So you're right. And the other piece of it, just to make the point that, quick bit of history about us, and Guy, I know that you know this piece of it, but early in our time, we had an article that was written about the sweatshirt that you're wearing in Slate magazine that called it the greatest hoodie ever made. Yep. And that I don't think it's an overstatement that without that article, I don't think we'd be here. I think that changed the trajectory of the business. One of the things that it did is it put us into a back-ordered status for almost 4 years. About 3.5 years, we're trying to catch up. Hard to believe that. But there is a reality there about how you manage growth, and both in terms of the planning for it. Do you get aggressive enough to meet the demand, but also how you scale your supply chain. And so there were some inherent limiters to our ability to scale our manufacturing at a pace that allowed us to maintain our integrity from a product standpoint. So
yeah. I want to get to some questions that we have from our viewers. Some really good questions. This one is from Tushar Desai. Tushar is a loyal viewer. Tushar, thank you for being here. Tushar asks, one challenge I face is the minimum order that American manufacturers expect. So Tushar asks, what is your suggestion to manage this risk in terms of cost versus inventory management, especially when startups are still trying to validate themselves in the market?
That's a great question, Tushar. I think just to put that into simple terms, oftentimes what you find is that domestic factories will ask for minimums 1,000 units of something or 5,000 units of something, and that's expensive and risky when you're just getting started. So I think, Tushar, I think that it's a two-part answer. I think one is don't take no for an answer. For the first year that we tried to make our sweatshirt in the U.S., basically everybody we spoke to told us that couldn't be done. But if you kick on the door long enough, our experience has been you'll find a factory that says, we believe it, we like it, we'll give it a shot, and I'll partner with you on it. And that in many ways has been the story of American Giant is our supply chain partnering deeply with us as a brand and really forming those bonds. So I think one part of it is talk to a lot of factories, and there are a lot of them, and find one that's a good fit for you. The other piece is, I think, convincing in partnership what you are trying to do and bring them along as believers. In our particular instance of this was, we have a very important vendor called Carolina Cotton Works. It's based out of Gaffney, South Carolina. It's a family business that's been around forever. The patriarch of that family was a guy named Paige Ashby. I had talked to everybody I could find. I finally found myself in a room with Paige. I told him the idea. I talked about that sweatshirt. And Paige finally said, to hell with it. I'm going to figure this out with you. And he threw his hat in with me. And without him, we could not have made that sweatshirt. But those people are out there, and just spend time on the road, get out of your office and get into the factories and talk to people. And I think you'll be quite surprised at what you're able to do if you're tenacious about it.
I'm just curious, Bayard. I mean, from a personal financial risk perspective, I have to imagine that it was a few years before you were able to pay yourself a decent salary.
The first, so the really quick story there, Guy, because it's a little bit more hairy even than that, is I had been running another manufacturing business prior to that, and I had just had my oldest daughter, Agnes, who was, I think, a week or two old, and I got fired from that job, and it was 2 weeks prior to Christmas. And that sharpens the mind quickly. You get pretty serious about things like healthcare. But I had gotten so committed about the idea of American Giant that I proceeded with a business and basically funded it through credit card debt for the first few months. And in that process, talked to Mr. Kendall, the Pepsi-Cola person I was mentioning earlier. And he wrote me my first check, which was a $25,000 check. It wasn't enough to pay me, but it was enough to begin to defray some of the cost. And he gave me a few milestones to hit. And then I hit them. And 4 months later, he put in another 25 grand, I think. And so he actually stayed with me in kind of this drip, drip, drip investment that gave me just enough. In retrospect, he was incredibly smart about that he was tough on me. He gave me just enough to get the elements in place that he needed to feel confident enough to put a bit more money into the business. So it was lean for a few years, but not so lean that I felt that I was being totally irresponsible about it. And I think within 8 months, I paid myself a nominal salary, and within a year and a half, I was paying enough of the salary that I could justify it to my family.
Wow. Let's talk about the pandemic. I know that I've from what I've read, I understand the early months were quite challenging. I mean, I think you had to. There were questions about supply chain, and there were production halts, and obviously this concern about the safety of people working in factories, and you even started to work out of your car in front of your house because you've got 3 kids at home. I imagine that's why you were working out of your car.
That's right. That's right. You probably had the same situation, Guy. I did this ridiculous sort of dance inside for a while where I was putting a sheet of plywood over my lap, and invariably every 5 minutes my 4-year-old Rose would come running into the room and yell at me and say, read me a book, or I want a sandwich or something. And so I eventually realized that if I could get the parking spot right in front of my house — we live in the Castro in San Francisco — right in front of my house, I could still tether to my Wi-Fi. And so that became my office. And it was great, by the way. It worked very, very well. I could just hop outside when I needed to be on a call or needed to be focused, slid my driver's side seat back, and I was good to go. And that was my office still is actually, but that was my office for quite a long time. I'm actually in our offices right now. But to speak about the pandemic just for a second, I think like everybody, when March came now over a year ago and the shelter-in-place orders happened in the Bay Area, the bottom fell out of the business. I mean, it really was scary. And our business, I think we were down 40 or 50% year on year. And I when I sleep at night, I keep a pad of paper next to my bed. If I'm not sleeping, I just get my thoughts out. And I still have this piece of paper, but I think the first or the second night of the lockdown, I wrote on that sheet of paper, I said that business is going to survive this, and we're not laying anybody off. And those became the kind of 2 guiding principles for the business that informed every decision that we made after that. And what that immediately looked like was we got into a very aggressive posture in cost cutting. And this is, to get back to the proximity and the people of a domestic supply chain, we were fortunate enough to be able to call all of our suppliers, all of our meaningful suppliers. And we and I have developed relationships with these people over the years. And whether that was Kevin McCarter at Clover Knits or Paige at Carolina Cotton Works or Andy at Parkdale, and say, look, we need help and we've got to cancel these orders. And 201 Guy, they all said, you tell us what you need, we'll figure it out. And so we were able to trim our supply back massively. We stopped our hiring. We canceled any software contract we could. I took a salary cut, and then my leadership team took a salary cut. But then little by little things began to recover, and by July we were growing again, and thankfully, and we were able to kind of to navigate it well. But to your point also, I think one of the things that comes into focus pretty quickly is we're in the Bay Area, and we had the luck of working from home. I was able to work from home. I don't get paid by having my hands on product every day, but our sewers and our operators in the Carolinas do. And we've got a lot of sewers that are in need. They get paid only when they show up at the factory. And so that was a big undertaking too, to make sure that we were being safe and that we were getting in the right protocols into those facilities. We had a brief period of time there where we were asked by FEMA to help make some masks for the federal government, and we had to convert our factories to do that. So it was a bouncy year. The dominant takeaway was that people across the organization stood up and became leaders and helped us navigate it. And it was an incredibly humbling experience for me to see how people stepped up in a very difficult time and got the business through what was I think once in a generation kind of moment.
And did you end up coming out of 2020? I'm assuming you had expected a catastrophic year, but did you come out of 2020 actually, with some revenue growth?
We grew, and that was growing despite our retail stores essentially shutting down. We had retail, which we had 4 doors in last year, produced. They became cost centers. They were not generating any revenue at all, but we did grow, and I think a bunch of things contributed to that. I think, to your point, people during the pandemic were particularly interested in the clothes that we make. They were buying sweatshirts and sweatpants and jeans and T-shirts and things that we happened to be in the right category at the right time categories. We didn't have, though we had 4 retail stores, we didn't have a ton of retail exposure. And I think the positioning of the brand of having a high quality, localized supply chain helped both from a customer interest standpoint and from our ability to be reactive. So it ended up, once the dust settled after the first 3 or 4 months of the lockdown, it ended up being a good year for us. A lot of that, by the way, was we learned so much about our business, about my management style, about all these things by being forcibly remote that helped get the business, I think, even more efficient and better than it was going into the pandemic. So great.
How did the past year change and sharpen and presumably improve your management style?
I've been thinking about this a lot. And I think that I have given lip service for most of my career, to empowering people to lead in my organization. And I think a lot of people do that, but don't actually do it. They talk about it, but don't actually do it. And that was the case in my case. I continued to manage my team as opposed to leading them and empowering them. And I think that and I've been maybe talking about that for many years in my career. I think what the pandemic did is, by the force of distance and working from home, it required that we give the control of all aspects of the business down to our senior people, to our brand new hires. And I don't want to overstate this, but almost without exception, everybody rose and stood up and did just incredible jobs about taking ownership and pride over what we do. And that was just it almost makes me emotional talking about it. It was just an incredible thing to be a part of, to see people throughout the organization step in and work hard and get things done that needed to get done in ways that were beyond what I think I'd ever believed was possible. So that has transformed the business in a really basic way. My management style now, I think, is totally changed. I think if you ask my leadership team, they would say he is way less involved in the day to day. We're running the business now, and he is really he's thinking about high level direction, but he's let go a lot of the day to day in a way that maybe I had a tendency to meddle and manage and get my fingers into the details. So I'm very grateful for that. It's been unexpected, but a totally positive change for me personally and for the business, I think.
Yeah, I read an article in Inc. magazine that was a profile of you a few years ago, and I was surprised because your entire day was meetings, and it seemed like you were really in the granular. You were into the granular side of things. It was like meetings about photography of catalogs and meetings about specific different kinds of yarns and design, and that was just a day in your life. And it seemed to me like that was quite a lot for the CEO of a company to be involved in every single step. It's something you'd want to do. It's your baby. It's your company, your business. And I understand that too, because I have those tendencies too as a leader. But it seemed like a lot. And I wonder if that is what you will go back to in a post-pandemic world.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of that now as you're saying that, guys. Go back and read that because that is really instructive, actually. And I think that point about it being my baby is that's sort of almost the narrative I told myself all along. Like, oh, it's my baby. I'm the only one to care that much. And in reality, throughout our organization, people have been um, uh, caring and managing better than I would. And so it's funny thinking back about that because you're right. That really was right. I hope not. I really hope not. And I think that it has been such a positive shift for us. And I feel it just kind of intuitively. I've got this great sense of almost a familial sense about our team at American Giant now that everybody, it's almost like you now, I think that the people throughout the organization are doing a better job of what they do than I ever possibly could. And so let's check back in a year, but I hope I don't go back to my old ways because they were not as effective. So I hope it's a permanent change.
I want to quickly ask you about your daily routine because there was you had a pretty extensive and disciplined daily routine. Get up at 5, get your coffee, spend an hour and a half on emails and working with no distractions at 6 in the morning, work out for an hour, have breakfast, go to the office, meeting, lunch, meeting, come home by 6, have dinner with your family. It was very disciplined. Have you been able to maintain that discipline this past year?
No, but some of the stakes in the ground have stayed. I still get up early. I still take a cold shower. I get out of the house early. But now I used to go sit in a coffee shop and get emails done and go to my gym. My version of that now is I go every morning. We got a dog just prior to the pandemic. I now take him for a walk in the Presidio every morning. That's everywhere from 3 miles to 8 miles, depending on the day. And so I'm not doing email, but I am doing a lot of my phone meetings or even my in-person meetings if we can maintain social distancing while we do that. So that part is very rigorous and very steady. Dinner with the family every single night. That's something that my wife has been just an incredibly positive force for, that we are all sitting down. So those things have stayed. But in between, it's kind of chaos, right? So I had an interview yesterday, and I realized as I was sitting reading a book at 4 p.m. to my daughter, and I thinking I had 15 minutes, my alarm went off my phone, and I was 10 minutes late to an interview. So
Yeah.
family is crowded in ways that I'm very grateful for. Actually, I've been able to spend time with my kids, all of whom are quite young, and connect with them in a way that I just didn't when I was back in a normal routine. So some things have stayed, but everything else has been pretty scrambled, and my email use has declined. I try to replace that with Zoom calls and phone calls and stuff.
I want to get to one more question before we have to wrap up from a listener. This is from Daniel Lee Bruce from via LinkedIn. Daniel asks, you described the negative social and environmental impacts of the fashion industry, particularly with manufacturing abroad and different environmental regulations or lack of. What kinds of initiatives is American Giant deploying in trying to bring awareness to the public about the trade-offs when you buy cheap clothing manufactured overseas?
Yeah, Daniel, that's a great question. We try to talk about it whenever we get the chance to talk about it. But I think our primary job is to stay true to who we are, deliver great product to our customers, and lead by example that way. It is there is so much money in the apparel industry and so much uh, greenwashing or social washing that happens from companies that are have practices behind the curtains that are not great. That it's hard to fight against that. And I think the only thing that we know how to do well is to talk to the media, to people like Guy who are interested enough to ask the question, and to continue to do what we do. We do some additional things. We've got something called the Delta Project. That is it's a series of events and speakers of people that are doing what we view as things that are good for communities, and that can be artists or activists or entrepreneurs that are making positive change in their sectors, their communities. But the bottom line is, I think the thing that we can do most effectively is to set ourselves up against a set of really clear values and then live by them and hold ourselves accountable to them, and then hopefully be judged well by consumers. And as we grow, begin to have more and more of a mouthpiece to get the industry to change.
It sounds like this past year has changed you as a leader, and it's certainly changed your management style. What is something that you have done besides the change in your management and leadership style? Something that you've deployed or that you've instituted at American Giant that has worked well that you want to continue into the post-pandemic world?
I think probably the most when the pandemic hit, and this is particularly true for our Bay Area employees, many of whom are young, many of whom live alone, and I think were isolated, maybe too strong a word, but isolated, and not having a communal setting to gather in. We instituted a morning call every morning at 9 o'clock where the whole company gathered. It's now gone down to 2 days a week. And that is a imperfect opportunity for us to all connect. But it is an opportunity to connect. And I think what my father-in-law used to have a barbecue in the summer months where he invited his office over to eat together every Sunday for 3 months of the summer. And that's always rattled in the back of my brain about the human connection about American Giant. And I think what dawned on me this year was seeing the people in our organization, and we've got, in my judgment, the best people in the world that work for us. And to see those people step up and to realize, man, this really is a group of people that care about this brand, that care about our mission. That sense of familialness and gathering and being together, that is something that I hope continues. I hope it doesn't continue as a phone call and can turn into more just social time together, that is just time about being together as a team, that I hope endures, because it's been fantastic for me to see and hear people on Zoom calls and on phone calls, in an isolated way a couple times a week.
Bayard Winthrop, CEO and founder of American Giant Apparel. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Guy. It's great talking to you.
And a couple quick announcements before we go. We have done about 80 of these live conversations over the past 13 months. We actually started this Resilience series just as the pandemic hit, and it was really designed as a way to be here for you, for our community of listeners. This today will be our last live stream, but don't worry, the Resilience edition and this Thursday episode is not going away. We will continue to do it. I will continue to have these less formal conversations once a week. We're just not going to live stream them anymore, but they will appear on the podcast. We will continue to video them. You will be able to see the video. Our team needs some time to kind of reset as well. It's been a lot of work. So the live stream will go away, but not the show and not the conversation. So just so you all know, thank you to all of you who've been watching for the past year and your support of this. What else? We have the How I Built This Summit is coming up. It's going to be at home this year. It's a virtual summit, but it's going to be probably the best summit we've ever done. It's happening May 24th to the 27th, and you can be part of it from around the world. Anybody can attend. You don't have to come to San Francisco like we do in normal years. You don't have to. The ticket price is not as expensive as normal. It's actually quite inexpensive. There are different tiers. I think $50. $50 you can attend the whole summit. We're going to have amazing speakers like Gary Vee and Brene Brown, Rashad Robinson, Adam Grant, tons of entrepreneurs and founders who've been on the show are going to come on and talk about very specific things like marketing strategies and supply chain and how to find a co-founder and how to build buzz around your product and all kinds of networking sessions. We are designing this to connect our community. So don't miss your chance to come to the How I Built This Summit this year. If you want to find out more about it and see the entire guest lineup, go to summit.npr.org, summit.npr.org. Check it out. You will not want to miss it. It is going to be amazing. So thanks everybody for watching. Bayard, thank you again for joining us, and I'm sure we'll probably see each other face to face at some point in this post-pandemic world.
Thank you, Guy. Thanks for chatting.
All right.